Going from constructs to variables is the point where ideas turn into a study. Up to this point, you have been working at the conceptual level. You have identified a phenomenon, articulated a problem, and clarified the constructs that matter. This step is about translation. It is where meaning becomes evidence. A construct tells you what you care about. Variables tell you how that construct will show up in data. You do not start by asking what you can measure. You start by asking what the construct means in this study. Variables come after meaning, not before it. When this order is reversed, alignment problems almost always follow. The first step is to define the construct clearly. This definition must come from the literature, and it must be cited. Constructs are not invented for a study, and they are not defined based on intuition alone. When you name a construct, you are locating your work inside an existing scholarly conversation. Citing how the construct has been defined tells the reader how you are using that concept and what intellectual tradition you are drawing from. It is also normal to find more than one definition of the same construct in the literature. Multiple definitions do not mean you chose the wrong construct. They usually mean the construct is important enough that scholars have approached it from different perspectives. Your task is not to resolve that disagreement. Your task is to choose a definition intentionally and explain why it fits your study. You might select a definition because it aligns with your population, your context, your research problem, or the outcomes you are trying to understand. This choice matters more than it often appears. The definition you select determines what counts as evidence, which dimensions you identify, which variables make sense, and which instruments are appropriate. Once you choose a definition, that meaning must remain consistent across the entire study. The construct should mean the same thing in the problem statement, the purpose, the research questions, the variables, and the interpretation of findings. Mixing definitions, even unintentionally, is one of the most common sources of misalignment. Once the construct is clearly defined and grounded in the literature, the second step is to break it into dimensions or components. Most constructs are not singular. They are made up of related aspects. Independence might include initiation, persistence, self-regulation, and strategy use. Engagement might include behavioral participation, cognitive effort, and emotional investment. Breaking the construct into parts prevents oversimplification and helps you see what kind of evidence would actually represent the construct you have defined. The third step is to ask what would count as evidence of each component. This is where variables begin to emerge. For task initiation, the evidence might be time to start a task, number of prompts required, or whether initiation occurs without assistance. For persistence, it might be time on task, completion rates, or observed response to difficulty. For self-regulation, it might be observed coping strategies or changes in emotional response during challenging tasks. These observable indicators become potential variables. Here is an example of a well-aligned chain. Suppose the construct is independence for learners with autism and dyslexia. In this study, independence is defined, based on prior literature, as the ability to initiate and complete academic tasks with decreasing reliance on external support. This construct includes task initiation, sustained engagement, and autonomous strategy use. Variables representing these dimensions might include frequency of prompts, level of support required, time to task initiation, and observed use of self-selected strategies. Those variables could then be measured using structured observation protocols, support logs, or rating scales. The construct is clearly defined, the variables represent that definition, and the measures align with both. Here is another example using a different construct. Suppose the construct is anxiety in learners with disabilities during academic tasks. In this study, anxiety is defined based on literature as a persistent pattern of cognitive, emotional, and physiological arousal in response to perceived academic demands. This construct might include worry or anticipatory fear, somatic activation, and avoidance behaviors. Variables representing those dimensions could include an anxiety score from a validated scale, observed indicators of avoidance during tasks, and self-reported frequency of worry thoughts during learning activities. Those variables could be measured using a standardized instrument for anxiety, a structured observation checklist, and brief reflection prompts administered at consistent points in the task cycle. Here is a third example that helps students see how a construct becomes variables without collapsing into a single indicator. Suppose the construct is engagement in an online learning environment. In this study, engagement is defined as a combination of behavioral participation, cognitive effort, and emotional investment in learning activities. Behavioral participation could be represented by variables such as assignment submission rate or completion of learning activities. Cognitive effort could be represented by variables such as performance on embedded checks for understanding or evidence of revision behavior across drafts. Emotional investment could be represented by variables such as survey responses about interest, relevance, or confidence. These variables could be measured using learning analytics for participation, assessment data for performance and revision, and a short engagement scale for perception. Now compare that to a common misalignment. A study claims to examine the impact of an AI tool on learner independence, but the only variables measured are number of logins and minutes spent using the tool. In this case, the construct is independence, but the variables represent usage. Usage may be related, but it does not demonstrate independence. The study ends up answering a different question than it claims to ask. This is not a small technical issue. It is a breakdown in the construct to variable chain. Here is what that correction looks like. Instead of claiming to study independence and measuring only usage, the study would define independence first, identify what behaviors indicate independence based on that definition, and then select variables that represent those behaviors. Usage data might still be included, but it would support the analysis rather than stand in for the construct itself. Another common misstep is oversimplifying a construct into a single variable. For example, a study claims to examine engagement, but uses attendance as the only variable. Attendance may be related to engagement, but it does not capture effort, attention, persistence, or emotional investment. The construct is complex, but the variable is narrow. The result is a study that measures something real, but not the thing it claims to study. These examples highlight an important point. Variables are indicators, not replacements for constructs. No single variable fully captures a construct. Variables provide partial evidence, and multiple variables are often needed to represent a construct responsibly. This is also where reading the literature becomes practical. To see how other researchers move from constructs to variables, look at the measures or instrumentation sections of studies, as well as tables and operational definitions. Pay attention to how authors define the construct, which definition they cite, and then how they name the specific variables used to represent it. You are not copying measures blindly. You are learning how the field has translated meaning into evidence. It is also important to keep the distinction between variables and instruments clear at this stage. A survey, interview protocol, rubric, or observation tool is not a variable. The variable is the score, code, category, or value produced by that tool. Confusing the tool with the variable leads to vague methods and weak alignment. Context also matters when moving from constructs to variables. The same construct can look different across populations and settings. Independence in elementary school is not the same as independence in workplace training. Engagement in an online course is not the same as engagement in a hands-on environment. Variables must match the population, context, and definition of the construct, not just the construct name. This step looks different depending on research approach. In quantitative studies, variables are named explicitly and analyzed for relationships or differences. Constructs guide which variables matter and how they are operationalized. In qualitative studies, you may not name variables formally, but the same logic applies. You decide what aspects of the construct you are attending to, what kinds of evidence would indicate its presence, and how you will recognize it in participant experiences. Constructs guide inquiry even when variables are not numeric. In mixed methods research, constructs often sit at the center while variables and qualitative data work together. Variables may identify patterns, while qualitative data help explain how participants experience and interpret the construct behind those patterns. The construct remains the anchor across both strands. A useful way to keep yourself aligned is to be able to say the full chain clearly. In this study, this construct is defined as this, based on this literature. It includes these components. It will be represented by these variables. Those variables will be measured using these tools. If you cannot say that chain clearly, the variables are not ready yet. Going from constructs to variables is not a one-time step. It is iterative. As you read more literature, refine your problem, or draft research questions, you may need to revisit which definition of the construct you are using, and whether the variables still fit that definition. That back and forth is not a flaw. It is part of building a study that is conceptually sound and methodologically aligned. When this step is done well, everything downstream becomes easier. Research questions sharpen. Methods choices make sense. Claims stay grounded. Going from constructs to variables is not about reducing meaning. It is about preserving meaning, while making it examinable.